I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Robert Kennedy made that stunning announcement, followed by a beautiful impromptu speech as he campaigned for president in 1968. His words are memorialized by this sculpture of the two men reaching out to one another. And exactly 2 months later, RFK himself would be assassinated. But what no one in the audience knew, and what few people in the world knew, was that Kennedy had previously approved a massive surveillance campaign against Martin Luther King, including wiretaps of his home, office, hotel rooms, and colleagues. And as information from those tapes continue to come out, they contain some explosive allegations. According to recently uncovered FBI documents, the most shocking charge is that King himself looked on and encouraged another preacher as he raped a woman in a hotel room. And if you think politics today is extreme, you're going to be blown away by how this story unfolds between King and the FBI. I'm talking communist spies, break-ins, murder, orgies, and the US government actually trying to get Martin Luther King to kill himself. It's wild. What I learned is disturbing on a number of levels. So why on earth did the Kennedy administration wiretap and follow Martin Luther King and his associates? After all, the Kennedys were solid supporters of civil rights, and publicly they supported King himself. It all started with the fight against communism. And it's important to understand the times as well as the power and role of the FBI. When J. Edgar Hoover took over the agency in 1924, he turned it into one of the most effective law enforcement machines anywhere. The FBI pioneered things like fingerprinting, forensic science, and criminal profiling. It set a gold standard in solving crime. And you can't really separate the FBI from Hoover himself. He took over the agency when he was just 29 years old, and he ruled it for 48 years until he died in 1972. And during much of that time, America was in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and they were a formidable adversary. That fight was at the heart of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the world has never come closer to nuclear war than the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The threat was real, and communists infiltrated the US government and cultural spheres, from spies to Hollywood influencers. Hoover's crusade against communism was important for the country's national security, although we'll see at times it veered into the realm of obsession and corruption. The FBI collected an enormous amount of surveillance on enemies, as well as on politicians and other powerful people in the country. Hoover used those secret files to not only fight communists, but to maintain his own power as FBI director. Everyone, including presidents, were fearful of being targeted by Hoover. One of those targets was this man, Stanley Levison, a lawyer from New York, and also one of the Communist Party's top financiers in the 1950s. The Communist Party was somewhat influential in the United States during the 1930s, although that lessened as the Cold War with the Soviets heated up in the 50s. Levison publicly supported the party at first, but in 1956 started hiding his involvement. That was also the same year he met a young Martin Luther King and became one of his closest friends and advisors. Levison negotiated business deals for King. He prepared his tax returns. He even co-wrote a draft of King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1962, when the Kennedys learned of that relationship and Levison's past, they sent King, who'd now become a national leader, numerous warnings through various messengers. When King rebuffed them all, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, approved the FBI wiretapping of Levison's office. Later that year, when King was employing another man with ties to communists, the Kennedy administration freaked out a little bit more and stepped up the surveillance. And finally, when a wiretap picked up King referring to Levison as his friend and saying that he'd resume connections once things cooled off, that pushed the Kennedys into wiretapping King's home and office. Now, ironically, throughout all of the wiretappings and informants and everything else, there's absolutely nothing to imply that King sympathized with communists. It was the opposite. He called it an alien philosophy contrary to the civil rights movement. But soon, the FBI wouldn't be focusing on communist ties anymore. They'd be focusing on sex. The Bureau expanded its electronic surveillance to King's hotel rooms on the road and had at least 2 of his employees working as paid informants. They tracked his flights and they monitored his associates. And they learned about a lot of sex. Now, King was married and a reverend, but the FBI records show numerous recordings of him having affairs, multiple sex partners, and even taking part in orgies. As this surveillance continued, Hoover's personal feelings towards King grew into hatred, and the FBI's role changed from gathering information to discrediting and harassing King. That campaign was part of a broader one called Cointelpro, which targeted people and groups the FBI considered a threat to national security. Some of the Bureau's activity was clearly illegal, and they were working to infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt political organizations inside the United States. These included the Communist Party, the KKK, the Black Panther Party, and others. The FBI would sow discord in the groups through psychological warfare, spreading misinformation, creating fake documents, or sending anonymous letters to get people paranoid. They used legal means sometimes. Sometimes they sparked IRS audits. Sometimes they did petty things like setting off fire alarms. The Bureau also likely arranged the killing of Fred Hampton, a Black Panther leader as well as another Panther. An FBI informant had actually drugged Hampton the night before a planned raid. Police fired over 100 rounds, and Hampton was shot at close range in his bed. Now, with Dr. King, the Bureau's goal was to expose and ruin him, and the sex tapes were their weapon. The most infamous tactic they used was a suicide letter. The letter was written and sent by Assistant FBI Director William Sullivan, who headed the campaign against King within the Bureau. He sent a best-of audio tape of King's sexual activities and included a letter as if it was from a disillusioned Black supporter. It told King to listen to his adulterous acts and sex orgies and evil playmates, then suggested that he should kill himself by Christmas or the information would be leaked. Now, for many years, all of this stayed secret. The FBI had tried to plant stories on King's behavior in newspapers, but none of them took the bait. It was a different time then, and things like that just didn't get reported, which was fortunate for both King and the Kennedys. And as crazy as all this seems, here's where the story takes another bizarre turn. On March 8th, 1971, Muhammad Ali faced off against Joe Frazier. They called it the fight of the century, and it was truly one of the biggest events in sports history. Pretty much everyone was watching or listening to it, which is why a group of 8 activists chose that night to break into a small 2-man FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania.
In other news, the FBI is reported preparing to shut down some of the 500 small agencies it maintains around the country because of security reasons. Last month, more than 1,000 documents were stolen from the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania.
They called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and they rightly believed the Bureau was overstepping its bounds and infringing on American citizens' rights. The burglars, who were never caught or punished, although they did come out later, stole over 1,000 classified documents, and their gamble paid off. They actually found documents that exposed Cointelpro. They mailed them to news outlets, but only one of them, the Washington Post, verified them and eventually ran a front-page story. It set off a national scandal. This wasn't just an overreach by the FBI. It was evidence that the government was willing to shred the Constitution in the name of national security. The scandal helped kick off the Church Committee, a Senate task force that conducted extensive investigations into the intelligence activity of the FBI, CIA, and NSA. It led to some significant reforms and, ironically, led to the discovery and exposure of many recordings of Martin Luther King. In 1977, U.S. District Judge John Lewis Smith ordered that all electronic surveillance of King be taken out of the FBI's hands and given to the National Archives. It was to be sealed and then made public after 50 years. But King's sexual encounters didn't come to light because of the FBI, but because of his best friend, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. By all accounts, Abernathy was King's closest confidant and the man he named as his successor. Yet in his 1989 book, And the Walls Came Tumbling Down, Abernathy gave a sobering account of King's final night before being assassinated. He wrote that King was intimate with 2 different women that night, and then a jealous third woman came by in the morning and an argument escalated into an assault. Abernathy wrote that King knocked her across the bed, and for a moment they were in a full-blown fight, with Martin clearly winning. Civil rights leaders went hard after Abernathy, but he never backed down. Now, I couldn't find an electronic version of this book anywhere on the internet, so I did take some pictures of those relevant pages, and I've linked to them down below. Later, tapes released of First Lady Jackie Kennedy after her death also contained some startling comments.
Then he told me of a tape that the FBI had of Martin Luther King when he was here for the Freedom March. And he said this with no bitterness or anything. How he was calling up all these girls and arranging for a party of men and women. I mean, sort of an orgy in the hotel and everything.
Martin Luther King?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. At first he said, oh, you know, and I said, oh, but Jack, that's so terrible. I mean, that man is, such a phony then. I just can't see a picture of Martin Luther King without thinking, that man's terrible.
But years later, as documents were released surrounding President Kennedy's assassination, some of the MLK records evidently accidentally slipped into the National Archives website, and they sat there for 2 years. Enter a man named David Garrow. He's a serious writer and historian who's concentrated on the civil rights era. His 1986 book on King, Bearing the Cross, took him a decade to write and won the Pulitzer Prize. He's also written one of the most definitive biographies of President Obama. Garrow spent weeks poring through tens of thousands of documents. Many were internal memos or summaries of the FBI tapes, and they were stunning. The FBI records from many of the wiretaps, interviews, and surveillance shows that they believed that King had been sexually involved with at least 40 women, including prostitutes. He had threesomes, foursomes, and more. When his wife, Coretta King, told her husband he wasn't fulfilling his marital responsibilities, FBI notes say that King told her she should go out and have some sexual affairs of her own. The FBI files also include allegations that famed baseball player Don Newcomb told the FBI that King had fathered a child with his relative, King's longtime girlfriend in Los Angeles. But the most shocking notes are the allegations of what happened in a hotel room in 1964. King and his colleagues were staying in the historic Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., near the White House. The FBI placed transmitters and lamps in 2 of the rooms, and then set up surveillance teams with receivers and tape recorders in nearby rooms. In the second bugged room was Logan Kearse, a Baltimore pastor, civil rights leader, and King's friend. The FBI summary says that Kearse had brought to Washington several women parishioners of his church. The group met in his room and discussed which women among the parishioners would be suitable for natural or unnatural sex acts. When one of the women protested that she did not approve of this, the Baptist minister immediately and forcibly raped her. On that typed summary, Deputy Director Sullivan, or one of his aides, had added in handwriting that King looked on, laughed, and offered advice. Now, that's not a minor allegation. Critics have come out and said this proves nothing. These aren't audio tapes, they're not official transcripts, and they're just notes from an agency that absolutely hated King. And that's a good point to consider. I've gone through hundreds of pages of those records, and they're pretty clearly internal documents, not something designed for public consumption. And Garrow makes the point that in the 1960s, no one in the FBI would have imagined that these notes would have ever seen the light of day. That doesn't prove they're correct, of course. But years later, they were reviewed again by the Bureau. According to Garrow, without question, Sullivan and his aides had both the microphone-transmitted tape recording and a subsequent full transcript at hand while they were annotating their existing typescript. In 1977, Justice Department's investigators would publicly attest to how their own review of both the tapes and the transcript showed them to be genuine and accurate. The FBI reports continued on to say that the next night at the Willard Hotel, King was part of an orgy with about a dozen people. Quote, when one of the women shied away from engaging in an unnatural act, King and several of the men discussed how she was to be taught and initiated in this respect. King told her that to perform such an act would, quote, help your soul. Now, an unnatural act can probably mean a whole lot of things, but according to FBI notes, quote, King announced that he preferred to perform unnatural acts on women and that he had started the International Association for the Advancement of Eaters. Garrow wrote that anyone familiar with King's often bawdy sense of humor would not doubt that quotation. When Garrow wrote up these allegations, in 2019, when Me Too was in full swing, the media reaction was, well, let's just say it was restrained. Multiple outlets rejected it. After it was published, most ignored it completely. Others made sure to pack in their stories with doubtful historians rather than seeking actual facts. The New York Times did that, and also dredged up a time when Garrow lost his temper and allegedly grabbed a woman's wrist 20 years beforehand. The paper even found a feminist to say that exposing King's female companions was sexist in and of itself. Ultimately, we should hear the whole truth in January of 2027, which isn't that far away. Those audio tapes are scheduled to be released in full. Given King's popularity, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a legal challenge somehow, but that's where things stand now. And to be clear, King's popularity is entirely justified. When I told a good friend of mine about the topic of this video, he was like, why would you want to do that? And it was a good question. I don't take pleasure in tearing down our heroes. None of us should. Of course, it also makes us ask, if these charges are true, should he be our hero? How do we evaluate flawed people? We've recently seen a reckoning with the flawed lives of many celebrated Americans. Statues and monuments to leaders and former presidents like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were removed by governments or torn down by mobs, not for their political acts, but for what we now see as their personal moral shortcomings. Should Dr. King be put in that category? Should disgraceful private acts negate the public good that someone's done? Maybe the real takeaway here is that even our most admired heroes are imperfect human beings. Despite their failings, the founding fathers, including Dr. King, dedicated themselves to building a better world, and that seems worth celebrating. I'm Ken LaCorte. I do my best here to give you a balanced overview of things and to look at some delicate subjects. If I screw up, I'll post corrections in a pinned post. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and until next time.